Hello, my name is Nick Carroll, and it's time to build a PC. In order to do this specific build, and most builds like this, I really just need 2 tools and a handful of other things that I do to prepare for beforehand. First and foremost, a Phillips head screwdriver. This is basically the core tool that's used in the bulk of all PC builds. It's tool number 1. I happen to have a handful of other bits for this as needed, but typically 1 Phillips head bit is what I use for most of them, except for maybe some of the smaller screws where a smaller bit is needed. Also, for some of the copper standoffs that are going to be used to secure the screws underneath the motherboard to the case itself, that's what this is for. Another thing that I'm using in order to prepare for this, about an hour before I start this whole process, is I have a ProCare Cool Mist humidifier. This is just a $30 inexpensive humidifier that I picked up from Walmart. Well, actually, my wife picked it up a couple months ago. But the reason I'm using this is because using a humidifier before you do a PC upgrade or build actually makes the air more moist, essentially, and it greatly reduces the chance that you'll have static electricity in the environment. Also, my door is locked and I kicked out the cat, but I'm going to have a video clip in just a moment that's going to show you the humidifier in action. I used it just before taping this video or recording this video and then shut it off for the rest of it, but I managed to saturate the air just a little bit. It's a little bit dry in the air currently, so this is going to help minimize that, as well as some other things I'm going to show you after that clip. So here is the humidifier. Not a big deal, just a little thing here. In the battle to combat static, I have 2 different grounding wires here. This is a wrist strap, which I'll put on my wrist here as I'm performing this PC build. This clip here, I will actually clip onto the power supply itself. The power supply will actually be turned off and inside the case, and the power supply will actually be plugged into the wall, and that will act as true ground. And then this other cable is going to be connected to this anti-static pad, and this is also going to be connected to the power supply. So let's start out with the Silverstone power supply. I'm going to go ahead and get this thing unboxed. See that right there. Then that will allow this to come open. There's the power supply manual and another manual. So let's go ahead and put that away. We'll refer to that as needed. I'll go ahead and get this power supply out, put it over here temporarily. Here's the power cable. Here are some mounting equipment if needed. I'm going to go ahead and toss this box aside. Pretty unexciting stuff, but it has to be opened. My kids love anything that pop, so I'll be sure and give them that. Look how tiny this power supply is. That's pretty nice. Not a 120 millimeter fan. I guess that's an 80 millimeter fan, but that'll work for this. It's a little 80 plus bronze power supply. That's fine. Oh, and while we're at it, we might as well open this up. It's got a nice little Velcro strap here to hold all the cables. So let's go ahead and show this for everyone. Pretty nice. CPU and so forth here. Extra power. Here's some power for SATA Molex connectors. Here's of course the 20 or 24 pin for the motherboard itself. That's pretty cool. Okay, I've placed the case on the table now, and this power supply is so small that I can't just drop it in by itself. It won't fit in because the hole is essentially too big for this little power supply. So that's where this bracket comes in. I'm going to go ahead and mount it to this bracket. So here are the actual instructions for putting this together. It's written in a bunch of different languages: English, German, French, Italian, etc. And it can kind of point you in the direction of what you need to do in order to essentially screw this onto this effectively. I've placed the power supply to where the cables are hanging off the edge here that puts it upright, and this plate fits right on top just like this. Pretty easy. So now I'm going to go ahead and screw it in. I just opened this up a moment ago. Let these come out. And then let me see if this will work. Yep, that should work for it just fine. Go ahead and get that going there. I'm not going to tighten up all the way. I'm just going to get it most of the way. Here's another one. I'm going to go ahead and put that here and get it most of the way, not all the way tightened. Go ahead and get this one here. Tighten most of the way, not all the way. Alright, now, since they've all lined up properly, I'm going to go ahead and screw this down a little bit tighter. I don't like tightening one 100% until all of them are close. That should do that. Okay, I wanted to show you real quick. This is what it looks like here when it's all screwed in. This is actually going to be facing down, and then I basically put it in like that. I'm going to show you a different angled shot momentarily. Okay, you can see here at the bottom, this is how it's going to go in, like that. And then it's I'm going to line it up and then screw all that in. Let's see if I can do it in this one shot. Oh, I realized I didn't have all the screws together, so I had to cut that moment in time. Okay, now I'm going to align this power supply and then put in a single screw. And this actually moves around a little bit. There's a little bit of leeway in terms of what I can do with it. But I'm going to go ahead and get the screw in there. I'm going to grab another screw. You know, I've not done this before, so this is kind of a unique experience for me. I've never actually filmed or recorded any of the PC builds that I've done over the, well, decades, to be honest. Let me see if I can get this in without problems. Okay, there, I got it. Oops. There. I don't want it tight at the moment. I just want to get the power supply semi-secured in a location, and then I can tighten everything up after that. I am not quite a fan of this bracket being silver with everything else being black, but to be honest, this is going to be facing the rear. No one's ever going to see this except at a LAN party, so care levels are low. Okay, now I'm screwing this in kind of slowly. Okay, I'm at the point where most of them are, I would say, hand tight. This is about where I want it. And one thing you'll notice is there's a little bit of room underneath this power supply in terms of the fan, and that's going to allow air to be sucked in from underneath into this and then pushed out the back, and that'll act as a little bit of a cooling mechanism for this power supply. Now that I've got it fairly tight, I'm going to go ahead and do a crisscross pattern. Tighten a little bit more. This is a little bit beyond hand tight, and that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and tighten up a little bit more, see if I can see the correct screw locations. Tighten up a tiny bit more. It's fairly tight. You can't undo it with your thumb, but with the screwdriver you can then undo that. And let me turn this over a tiny bit so you can kind of see a little bit better. This is what we're looking at. That's not that bad. We still got plenty of room in this case for everything, and I can route these as needed. I turned on a couple more lights to make this a little bit easier to see, and I'm going to go ahead and open up this, show you the contents inside. Here's one of the SATA cables that's included. Here's a GIGABYTE sticker. Here's the I/O panel, the shield that will be used. Another SATA cable. Looks like a pair of SATA cables. In fact, I believe there's probably a pair of, yep, 4 SATA cables so far. We've got the driver CD, which I probably won't even use. I'll probably just use whatever I get online. The motherboard user's manual and an installation guide. And yes, I will actually review these briefly while between clips. And here is the motherboard itself. I'm going to lift this up, see if there's anything else in there. Nothing else in the box. I'm going to go ahead and close this up, move it out of the way, put it here, see if it'll show up in the shot. Hey, look, there it is. Here's the motherboard itself. It's in an anti-static bag, which I will promptly remove. Here's some tape. Well, that's some tough stuff. Time to bring out a pair of scissors. Yep, I'll leave the pair of scissors out. Ta-da! See if I can get that in the frame. And actually, let me turn it the other direction so you can see it. This is an FM2 Plus motherboard that's backwards compatible to the FM2 style or pin grid array. And here are the connectors. We're going to go in this direction. You see a legacy PS2, some USB ports. We have your video, your SVGA, your DVI output. We have HDMI out, some USB 3 ports. Looks like a DAC. Yeah, looks like a DAC, digital audio converter. More USB 2 ports, Gigabit Ethernet, and then of course here's the audio out, optical audio, and then of course other stuff. Then here are the PCI Express slots, PCI slots, and then all the usual assortments. Here's where the APU is going to go, and here's the memory. You'll notice that there's 2 black and 2 green. I'll refer to the manual to determine which slots to put the memory in. Due to the length of these cables, some adjustments are going to need to be made as I insert the motherboard into here. What I'm going to do first is basically bring the motherboard over the area where I believe the screws are going to need to be placed, and then I'm going to locate where the standoffs will go, remove the motherboard, and then go ahead and screw the standoffs in. So I'm now looking at the motherboard itself and the orientation it's going to face, and I notice that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes, and then here's a 7th one here. So 2, 4, 6, 7, just to verify, and then this will go in the motherboard in the case just like that. And the ones that line up are these two, these two, these two, and then this one there. Or actually, I'm not seeing one there. So we'll see how that goes. I've removed this I/O panel from the plastic wrapper, and now that I know its orientation in this case, I'm going to go ahead and place it in there. You have to basically kind of hand tighten it in there. Easier said than done, but gotta go in there. You hear it pop as it goes in all the way. I'll check to ensure that it's secure on all 4 sides. And let me show you what it looks like when it's in there. Not bad. So it looks like these copper standoffs are just a little bit too large for the tool that I was going to use earlier. So I've got a little bit of a larger driver that fits it just fine. So now I'm going to go ahead and put this together. Okay, so I've placed each one of these copper standoffs in the 6 locations I know for sure I can use for the motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up where they're a decent bit tight. You don't want to wind them up really tightly because you risk stripping the threads here, but you do want them decently tight so that when you put the motherboard in place and you screw the screws through the motherboard through the to the copper standoffs, you want to ensure that in twisting those screws around you don't end up fusing essentially the screws to these copper standoffs. You don't want those to be too tight either. So it's kind of a little bit of a balancing act. You want the standoffs to be adequately tight against the frame, and likewise you want to make sure the screws that you do mount the motherboard to the frame are not overly tight to where you end up having issues unscrewing those down the line. So I'm just applying a decent amount of torque to each of these standoffs, and then I'm going to load this up inside and verify that indeed I am correct with the selection of standoffs used. I'll move that. Also, in between clips or takes or whatever, I'm firing up the humidifier just to make sure. It looks like that is all correct. Now it's just a matter of moving that out of the way. And then I have to make sure that, let me move this back a tiny bit so you can see. Got to make sure that this goes in there just fine. One thing I noticed I forgot to do on this motherboard is I forgot to take these caps out from over these video ports, because that'll prevent this from actually going in. Look like there's nothing else that blocks. So I'm going to go ahead, put this back in there. I realize this may not be the best angle that I'm getting this. Okay, I've got that lined up fairly well. I can see each end, each standoff through the holes, and I'll tighten that next. Alright, so this part took a little bit more time and intensity than I'd figured, but I managed to get each of the screws in all the locations screwed in after about 8 or 9 minutes of just positioning the motherboard, inserting each screw, and then a couple times dropping the screw and having to pick it back up. Basically made sure I have this strap on here, and I've got this to the case itself. I haven't been able to route power all the way through, so I'm fairly grounded, and I've just ended up leaving my humidifier running in the background just to make sure the chances of static are minimal. Now it's time to open the CPU. One thing you'll notice is I'm actually putting the motherboard in first and then putting the CPU on it, and then I'll put the RAM in its place. But the reason I'm doing it this way is my personal preference is I have a hard enough time inserting the motherboard over the years into the case and making sure that it's there properly, that I don't like any of that other stuff in the way to complicate that process. So I want to make sure I can get that motherboard in there nice and secure, and then I can test everything. Some people like to place the motherboard on a box or just on an anti-static pad and assemble everything that way and then drop it into the motherboard. In my personal experience, doing that is just harder to do when you're trying to get that motherboard in there and everything aligned. But everyone's got their personal preference, but this is mine. So this is basically what's next. This is the APU. So this AMD APU, I keep calling it a CPU, is basically a quad-core CPU with octa-core GPU built in, and the two work together. So you get 8 Radeon cores essentially in this unit. You'll notice there's the stock fan. I'll go ahead and pull this out. Let me see. Here's the actual APU itself. Then I'll go ahead and show this. There's all the pins below. And you'll notice there in the center, that's where the actual APU is underneath that. The entire die is not this entire width. That's the heat spreader, essentially. This. So there's that. And then of course here's the stock heatsink. I'm going to pull out. And I'm going to use this at this time since I'm not doing any overclocking initially, and since I'm only running an APU and the power supply fan, and then a handful of other power supply fans, it should not make too much noise. One thing you'll notice is there's a sticker that's included as well. I do not plan on using that, but I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And I'm just going to remove this APU. I'm going to try desperately not to touch any of these wires, or pins I should say. You'll notice, man, I hope I can pick this up. There's a little arrow right there. That's going to be oriented a certain way on this socket. And this is a 0 insertion force socket. It should not require any strength or effort in order to use. And let me verify the pin location. I use my trusty smartphone flashlight app in order to spot the arrow, and I was actually oriented in the right direction. So I'll go ahead and place this over it, and you notice it fell right in. I didn't have to force it. Fell right in. And then I can go ahead and close this. One thing I always do before inserting it is I'll physically look and make sure all the pins, and there's over 1,000 of them typically, several hundreds at a minimum, and you want to make sure that none of them are bent. I have seen it in the past where one is bent and you can't insert it all the way, and then you have to, with a pair of tweezers or something very fine, get the pin sorted. But fortunately that does not happen a lot. And I will go ahead and let's see about placing this fan on. This actually has, I'll show you here, this actually has some, I don't know what you call it, the coolant is actually displaced on here already on the stock cooler. So ordinarily with a custom cooler you would basically put just a little dab of some thermal paste, usually about the size of a grain of rice or a drop, in the very center. Some people like to spread it about, others like to just leave it there and let the heat spreader spread it apart. But in this case, this stock cooler actually has fine amounts of coolant already on it. I do not need to place it on there. And also I'm not going to be overclocking for at least a month, and at that point I'll determine to what extent I'll overclock and to what extent I need a custom cooler. But for now I'm going to run this for the first month without that. So you'll notice here's these little clamps and here's this cable. So you need to orient this in such a way. There's two ways to orient it. There's a hook here, here's a hook here, and then these two are going to go over the hook. And you can typically do it one way or the other, but typically what you do is you orient this cable in such a way that it'll go over the CPU fan header right here without too much issue. So since the lever is right here, I'm going to go ahead and put it on this way. So I'm going to put it over here on this side, get it under that hook. I'm going to place the fan over there, get it nice and centered, make sure that is still there. Okay, hook that under there. Whoops, it fell off on that side, so I need to put it back. So I'm going to undo the hook on this side. I'm going to hook that here. under there. There we go. I'll leave that under it. I'll use some tension on my finger to make sure that it stays there. Okay, now this is the right way. Okay, so got it. Okay. Doing this in real time. I'm not. There we go. Now I've got that centered. I've got the hook on both ends. I'll go ahead and do that. It's firmly in place. Then now I can route this CPU fan cable over this way. Some people like to twist it just a tiny bit to kind of eliminate some of the chance that the cables might splay about. Okay, now I've got that inserted. That's pretty much out of the way. Okay, next up is the RAM. Here's the G.SKILL Sniper Series 16 gig kit. There's an 8 gig and another 8 gig memory module in here. They're supposed to be used in a pair, and as a dual channel kit, so that each of these DIMMs goes in a different channel, thus doubling your bandwidth essentially. And in this case we have basically 1, 2, 3, and 4, so the green, green, black, black. So in the case of these two here, we're doing both of these in the green one. If I were to get another pair, I'd put it in the black, but that's how this is going to be set up. And I'm going to go ahead and remove, open this up. Here are the memory modules. Give you a close-up look at them. Okay, here's one of them. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up the other one. It's a little hard to do on film. That plastic side. Okay, here are the two memory modules. They're going to only go in one way, so I'm going to go ahead and open up these. Okay, this is going to go in slot 1. Okay, that snapped in firmly without much of a fuss. And this next one is going to go in. Again, I'm going to sort of snap that in. Now they're all nice and firm with no issues. I've run into my first unfortunate situation. There are two fans in this case that happen to use the same connector type. That in itself is not an issue. There's a front fan in the front of the case, which is under there, which basically pulls air from the front of the case, into the case. And then we have another fan back here, which by default is pushing fan out of the case. So each of these use a 3-pin connector. However, there's only one 3-pin system fan connector on the motherboard. So while I can plug in one or the other, I cannot plug in both. There are two other system fan places where theoretically I could plug this up to, but they have 4 pins as opposed to 3. And looking at the wiring diagram on the motherboard manual, these pins are different than what is needed here. So it looks like I'm not able to use this on this motherboard. So that's a little bit depressing, and I don't feel like experimenting and plugging into there. So that's the first hitch that I've run into, and I'm going to have to replace this with one with 4 pins so that it can intelligently work with the motherboard to variably adjust its power. I've actually decided upon further review, rather than letting the fan that's in front operate. I mean, you're pretty much not going to be able to prevent air from coming into this case, and there's plenty of ventilation on the bottom, the front, the back. So what I'm going to do in this case is connect this back exhaust fan to the motherboard, and then I'll have to make a trip to Fry's tomorrow and then correct the fan situation there. So I'll route this cable around here and then I'll go to the next step. It's time to start connecting the other cables, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at the motherboard power first. Unfortunately, this is not a modular power supply. In this case, isn't optimally designed for cable management. This is an interesting dilemma. This can't reach. I wonder how I'm going to solve this problem. One trip to Fry's later, and I have some extension cables for the ATX power supply and a Molex to 3-pin fan cable that I will use for the fan. Hopefully this will work. To be fair, or not fair, to be critical, I expected more from this bundle in terms of compatibility. I would have expected the length of this ATX cable would have been correct for this, and I'm under the impression this bundle was not properly inspected. I'm hoping this will work in terms of an extension. That's what it says it is, an ATX extension. So far I'm not getting that. It's a little distressing. Maybe I'm just not. Yeah, there we go. That is in there. Now let me open this up. I'm opening this up off to the side because I noticed there's a couple staples in the package and I don't want to risk putting any staples in my PC build. I'm already putting 2 extension cables in this build that I did not plan for. So let's see if this will work. And at this point, there's actually an excessive amount of cabling. Let's see if this will connect. It looks like that'll work. Move this out of the way. It looks like this would have to essentially come around this way. Use a little cable management and then insert the power connector. That goes there. This should go here. Well, I'm wondering if there's not enough room. See that? That's a little disconcerting. I'm gonna have to remove this. See if I can get this, see which orientation this is supposed to go in. It's supposed to be that little clip is supposed to go in this direction. So that actually goes in just fine there. Now let me try this. See if this will go through. I just want to see if this will even work. If this will even connect in without issue. This goes in that way, not here. This goes in here. Wow, this is upsetting. Okay, looks like that's not going to work. Okay, after a little bit of kvetching on my part, I ended up just grabbing a a PSU from another computer I have, and I'm going to use that instead. I'm a little bit cross that even with those two extension cables that they're not the right type and they're not going to work here. This is, if I remember correctly, an 80 plus gold power supply that I had put in my wife's computer. I'm simply going to have to put the Silverstone PSU in hers, providing that it fits. It should, but if it doesn't, I'm going to go ahead and send that back to Newegg with some complaints, and likely I'm going to send some complaints. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and continue with this. I'm going to go ahead and drop this connector onto the motherboard, or actually connect it. To be clear, I'm not going to drop it, but I'm going to go ahead and support the motherboard with my hands. Okay, that's snapped in tightly. So this is here. It's a little unsightly. It's not the way I would have preferred, and knowing what I know now, I would have probably chose a different bundle. I would have still got all the major components, but I would have maybe paid a little bit more for a different power supply or a case. But I mean, everything else I'm liking the way it is, but I'm not quite turned on by this power supply, and I may end up getting a replacement down the line. Alright, let me figure out what next to connect. So as it turns out, the power supply I tried to use in place of this Silverstone power supply doesn't have all the necessary connectors to supply power to the ATX 12 volt connector here. There's a set of 8. All of these need to be filled right here. You can't see it. I don't really care at this point. And this power supply is not long enough to reach in order to power this motherboard and be plugged inside this case. And even if it were a few inches longer, we're looking at a mess. So I'm thoroughly frustrated, and I'm calling an end to this disgusting build attempt. This is going to conclude this build attempt. Unfortunately, it's not successful like I originally intended. The kink in this armor is unfortunately the power supply. Everything else looks like it's going to come together successfully, so tomorrow I'm going to actually put everything else together and get the system ready to go for a replacement power supply. I'll also reach out to Newegg tomorrow and see if I can get a replacement power supply. Hopefully that won't take more than a week. And once that power supply comes in, I'll produce an update video indicating that the success has occurred, and then from there I will continue to do the other 2 parts of this 5-part series. Anyways, thank you very much for your patience in watching this build. Unfortunately, it's not going to end up in success. I have debated whether or not I'm going to even publish this, but what the hell, I've put a couple hours into doing this, so I might as well post it for anyone that's interested. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.